Hello survivors and welcome to First Aid Spray. Welcome to a brand new series, the first installment in something that I think we're calling now, that's what I call survival horror. I'm joined by Sherwin, who you can hear there.
Yes, hello. Thanks, Si.
And we're about to...
I think it should be. Now that's what I call survival horror. What else could we call it?
Absolutely. I've put it on record now, so it has to happen.
Done.
Put it into the universe. Cool. This is something that we've wanted to do as a part of First Aid Spray in general, and me and you specifically for a while, is find a place to talk about Resident Evil music. And there was a bit of thinking on how exactly we go about it, whether that's just like a big full-length podcast episode, and then originally I came to you and said let's do a top 10 countdown sort of editorial video. Instead it's become a sort of short form podcast conversation, and the two of us are going to talk about the soundtrack in this particular installment for the original 1996 Resident Evil. Sherwin has picked his top 10 favourite tracks from that game, and we're going to talk about those. As always with everything like this, just putting it out there, it's a personal list. Sherwin picked these himself. This is his personal opinion. Whether you agree or disagree, we'd love to hear about it. Any chance we get to talk about the music. So fire up that comments. Let us know what you thought was missing from the list, what you would swap around by all means. But yeah, it is a personal list. And this is the ball rolling on a new series, and we'll see where we go from here. Plan is to cover the majority of the soundtracks and see what happens. But so Sherwin, let's get started. You're starting at number 10 down to 1. So what's the number 10 slot?
So number 10 is Finally the Two Met. So I guess the starting point, we should probably start off with, perhaps this isn't relevant to the Finally the Two Met, but I think the first point to make about the Resident Evil 1 soundtrack is it's much more orchestral, I think, than some of the games that followed. I just want to quickly jump in there before we get into the list too much, because I hadn't realised quite so much, because you kind of get used to these things until I actually went back and listened, and it kind of blew my mind. It's not necessarily even the orchestration that's happening. It's more, the instrumentation. It's more about the way that the actual tracks are put together.
Right.
It's more about the way that people have approached, it's sort of they actually approached actually composing the music and actually bringing it forward. There's a lot more going on in terms of layered kind of melodies or harmonies or even kind of instrumentation kind of running through. It's much more traditional in its build. So it's really interesting for RE1. And then having said that, sorry, go on.
Yeah, I was just going to say, that's very true. This piece in particular, and I know that's going to come up several times with a few of them, but this one in particular is, in contrast with video game music that would have come before this time, it's much less rigid, especially this track is, I wouldn't call it lackadaisical, but it's very laid back, and the way the notes sort of flow off, it doesn't fit like a very beef bap kind of like classic Mega Man music structure, do you know what I mean? It's not just 4/4 on the floor. There is, a sense of actual classical music to this.
Yeah, absolutely. Bonus points for 4/4 on the floor. Tremendous reference. Made me very, very happy. So the first one is Finally the Two Met, or number 10, I should say. And if I'm entirely honest, I think this is going to be one of the unexpected tracks that people won't be thinking will come up. It's definitely one of the short ones. And I think for me, and obviously we talked about it being subjective, one of the reasons I like this so much is because it really reminds me, it's really reminiscent of the original PlayStation. The synth instrumentation, it's extremely evocative of that first wave of PlayStation games that came out. We all go way back to stuff like, Crazy Ivan and definitely sort of, going back way back, as you can tell from that release. It's exactly the kind of sound that you heard from what these things were. But also, just going back into in a Resident Evil world direction, what's really compelling about this track is the gentleness that arrives once the strings start. There's this tangible sentiment of relief that accompanies the idea of Jill and Chris meeting again, but also because it really does feel like a safe haven. Bearing in mind, obviously, the player at this point has been creeping through the labs. They've been kind of fighting off various different enemies, chimera zombies, all sorts of things. This is really a safe haven from the nightmare outside. And I think this track, you've got me doing it now. This track really encapsulates, I think, that whole feeling.
Yes, yeah, relief is the word that I wrote down, definitely. Especially because you don't see the other player character in your entire campaign up until this moment, whether you play as Chris or Jill. This is the first time you come across them and, getting to free them from the cell. It's a big part of that sort of arc of getting the best ending, if you like. Especially if you're playing through the first time and you've just picked whichever character you've decided to play as, and then you're seeing your other character finally at this point. Yeah, I thought it was a really interesting choice, but you've got a couple of
Well,
them on this list. I'll say that much.
yeah, right. I couldn't be completely obvious because otherwise that's
Right. Well, where's the fun in that?
Yeah, right. I tried to pick the ones that I think genuinely introduce something interesting, more interesting than others, or really encapsulated a specific feeling for what the game was. And I think this is definitely one of them. And this one, as said, it's quite unexpected, but yeah, I'm glad you enjoyed it. So that's all good. So moving on, number 9 is Requiem. So I think for Requiem, it's one of those ones where you should only really hear this, and it's interesting you said about the good and bad endings if you did think badly. So it's not one that if you blasted through this and got a great ending first time and never looked back, you'd ever even hear.
Right.
But this is something which, for me, is one of the most emotionally powerful pieces in the entire game. It's the piece that accompanies Barry Burton's death. And right from the start, this track is really conveying, obviously, the tragedy of what that moment is. What's really interesting is it's the supporting instrumentation in the background. It adds this dramatic sense of urgency. This isn't a reflective track where it sort of plays very slowly and very calmly and really kind of hits you in the feels in the traditional sense, is what I think a lot of people would be used to now. It's something where if you actually listen to it, there's this driving beat in the background that doesn't ever quite let you settle. It doesn't quite let you really come to terms with anything, because ultimately, you're experiencing this and you're either running away from hunters that are trying to, basically kill you, or alternatively, there's the lab's about to explode or whatever else. There is this sense of urgency that goes with this, as well as the tragedy. And those two things really combine to the point where it just feels, I'm going to use the term again, but it just feels uncomfortable listening to it. It feels very, very visceral. I mean, obviously, it kind of really, really builds up to a finale as it goes through. Yeah, and I think basically it's something which really just doesn't let up whatsoever. And that, for me, even at the late stage of the game that it occurs, is really interesting, because you think you've heard everything, you think you know exactly what's happening, and then the game just suddenly hits you, bam, with this thing, and it just takes over.
Yes, I would agree with a lot of that. As you say, a lot of people probably haven't heard this music. I haven't heard it in a very long time. I can't speak for everyone, but when I replay this, I just will always aim for the best ending. Why wouldn't you? I want to save everyone, right? And I think a lot of people who are like newer fans, if they were to go back and play the original Resident Evil, they're probably just going to do it the once. So they're probably going to follow a guide or whatever, or happenstance come across the best ending and probably, not hear it. And what you said about it maybe not punching in the feels in a way that music would these days, is in the sense that it's not delicate or anything like that. It is much more driving. Is more powerful because of the way that it plays out on screen. It's not just Barry slumping over and that's it. You pick up. He gives you a photo of his family and a message that he's written, and it instills this sort of drive of, okay, it got to get vengeance for Barry. Got to do right by our fallen comrade. It's not just about the tragic sadness of Barry's death. It's, you have to do something about this. This might be the most genuinely cinematic sounding piece in the score for me, and I think part of that is the fact that it doesn't have to loop or anything like that. It doesn't rely on any loop, so it is just sort of like 35 seconds of build.
Yeah, I think that's fair. I think I agree. It's something where what's really remarkable for me on this as well is you see a lot of your buddies get killed over the course of Resident Evil, and some of them even come back to bite you afterwards. But this is the one that has the most drama to it by a long way. So Cool. Well, moving on then from that to a slightly more upbeat, well, no, massively more upbeat track is number 8, which is Concealed Passage. And I will admit, this one is the one that I think even Psy probably fell off his chair looking at the looking on the list. So this one is completely out of left field, and this one really is for the jazz fans out there. It's a really schizophrenic track with so many ideas crammed into such a short loop. And the best part about that short loop is it literally is a boulder rolling down, rolling into a wall and breaking a hole, and that's it. It's not a big event in the game. It's not something which is really super dramatic or super key to the plot or anything. So the obvious question is, how did it make the list? Well, it's super unique. It's got the same orchestral writing of all the other tracks, but in the game, but it honestly just doesn't really fit whatsoever into Resident Evil at all. There's hints of just how much stuff used to sound, or how much music used to sound back in the day. It could be, I can hear elements of Zelda in this. I can hear elements of Castlevania in this. I can even hear elements of kind of like Mega Man in this. It's got this incredible mismatch of different styles and so on, sort of rammed in there. And what's really important is, one of the reasons why I think I put it on this list is Resident Evil will never sound like this ever again. It departs so heavily from the survival horror theme. It's this sort of really interesting glimpse of what the world looked like before Resident Evil, and then what the world started to look like after Resident Evil, because it really defined new things. And Resident Evil itself, of course, went off in a very different direction, which we'll cover a little bit later on.
I find that highly amusing, considering that this piece of music plays as a boulder rolls by, like sort of like the passage of time.
I hadn't even thought of that, but yeah.
The boulder obviously being, a huge villain in the Resident Evil series. As you see it first in this game, it comes back in 4, and then you finally defeat it at the end of 5.
Lovely language. Absolutely lovely language.
Yeah, this is definitely a weird one. Like you say, it's... I don't have a whole lot to say about this one in particular, but it's funny that you say all that, because I can hear something in this track which ties it, even though it's very different to a lot of the rest of the soundtrack, it ties everything into his... There's these weird sort of discordant noises in the back. There's some sort of scattered melody, some other melody happening in the background, which is going to come up in future tracks. That's what I picked out most from this, but yeah, very interesting choice nonetheless.
No worries. So number 7 is Narrow and Close. So I think we're definitely into more familiar territory now for survival horror fans. This is obviously the track from the basement, not the clown version.
Yeah,
and it's but even without having creepy clowns, it's deeply unsettling. It really doesn't ever let the player rest. It doesn't ever let the player get used to it. It's got jagged slices of sound bisecting this already discordant soundscape that just doesn't really sound human or familiar in any way, shape, or form. Even the strings, which kind of come in at some point, they provide a little comfort. They're more familiar from what you've heard in previous tracks, but at this point they really come in at the edge of earshot. They rise in unsettling patterns, and then they're suddenly cut off again by the sort of jagged slices of sound. I think what's really interesting is this is something where it's a track that represents the player descending into the darkness of the basement. That place in traditional survival horror games where you really don't ever want to go. Why would you ever go into the basement, deep into the ground where you can't get out? And it's extremely powerful from the first few seconds onwards. And what's really awesome is that, but at this point in the game, you've kind of battled your way through most of the mansion. You've kind of fought your way out to the guardhouse. You've killed a giant monster plant that wants to kill you. You've kind of come back. You've encountered hunters. at this stage you're feeling pretty doody about, well, I can take on anything in the world, and then suddenly now you're descending into the basement and there's this really scary music, and at that point and I'm not I'm not a dude at all anymore. I'm now scared. I'm terrified once more. This I thought I'd seen everything this game has, and obviously it's even more remarkable considering that, and I'm sure you'll perhaps mention on this, there's not actually anything all that scary down there.
Right, that's exactly what I was thinking. There's some zombies or some hunters. I think that's really the only option you got. Okay, hunters can be threatening, especially in close quarters. But it's after what you've been through, you're right. But it's just the power of atmosphere, isn't it? It's just goodness me. I completely agree. This is one of the most threatening pieces of the entire soundtrack. It's just I don't know how it rides this line of atmosphere, and it's like violent. Like the synths, the way they just bam, bam. They are so sudden in the way that they appear and the way they're cut off as well. Like you said, they just suddenly stop. Something else I just love about it is not even necessarily the music, but the name, Narrow and Close, sums it up wonderfully. Like everything that you've faced beforehand, and yet just the idea of being in this dark, cramped space is also a type of fear of its own. This is one. This is a hefty one. This is one I always think of when I think of the original soundtrack. Definitely that starting synth noise that comes up, especially, just screams Resident Evil to me, which is so funny. Because on a mainstream perspective, of course, when you say Resident Evil basement, everyone's going to think about, the clown flatulence. But this is
I think that's what's really interesting is that itself made such a remarkable point in me. I can actually hear those clown noises in my head right now.
Oh, absolutely.
They have stuck. They are more horrific than this track. It unfortunately can never be. They're never going anywhere.
Yeah, but thankfully for us, we're not ranking the DualShock soundtrack.
No. That's we'll leave that one to Adam. But that's fine. It's a side. No, we'll get onto that at the end, because I'm sure I can convince you to get me back for a Gaiden soundtrack one of these. I can't wait for that.
Is there 10 songs in the soundtrack?
I don't know if we could actually make that 10. That might be a short segment. So let's move on. So number 6 is Peace of Mind. So I will be the first to admit that I'm not a massive fan of two different themes in Resident Evil games. One is save room themes, and the other one is countdown themes, which is one that you probably expected to be on here. But I think this is certainly one of the better save room themes in the series, and it's definitely welcome on this list. I always hear this, and it's really evocative to me of this warm and steady light in a calm place. It really paints a picture of a safe haven. In any room you go into in the game and this starts playing, you just feel safe. You don't ever have this hint of okay, danger is around the next corner or anything else at all. It feels like you're completely safe, and that's obviously something which actually later Resident Evil 2 and 3 really played on, when you kind of have what you think is a safe room when you get into the gun shop and Kendo gets dragged out the window, or alternatively when Nemesis crashes through the church and the safe music stops, for example. This is the first time that you kind of really feel like you've got an oasis. But what's also cool about this is it's one of the few tracks in the soundtrack that's quite minimalist in terms of how it's actually in its construction. So it keeps a very simple loop. It doesn't really introduce anything new to challenge you, because obviously challenges are for outside of this safe haven, in terms of enemies and horrors and all sorts. And there is a hint of something sinister, which is nice. It doesn't quite relent. There's a little bit of a hint as it goes off, which kind of, it's the familiar refrain we'll come back to with this soundtrack, which is drawn out notes. It's kind of got that hint of something eerie, something slightly terrifying, that reminds the player, hey, you're safer now, but that's temporary. You are going to have to step outside of this door again. And when you are, that thing, that's kind of that long drawn out note, that kind of zombie groan or whatever, that's still out there waiting for you.
Yeah, I think this one has less of the threatening aura than perhaps the later PS1 entries. It is really just how those notes hold on. This more leans into the feeling of serenity to me, but it is there, and this is the baseline for the save room themes, because I think the later ones and part of the more threatening balance that they bring is just because of they're much more complex. This, as you say, is really just two things. It is just those long drawn out sort of synth choirish sort of sounds, and then those repeating four notes basically, or whatever it is. It's like a harp or whatever you want to. I guess it's a synth, so whatever you want to imagine it on. But the save room themes is just it will perpetually be, and I'm sure this will probably come up in later installments of this. It will perpetually be something that I could never pick the best one, but this is right up there. Just the simplicity is wonderful, and it's one. And yeah, we just talked about one of the other songs that I think of immediately when we talk about Resident Evil 1, but this is just a song that I think of immediately when I think of Resident Evil as a whole, not just the first game. It's almost like a theme song in my head for the original Resident Evil, if not the series.
Yeah, cool. Well, I'm glad I put that as the lofty heights of number 6. So let's move on. So number 5 is Flooded Corridor. So I think Flooded Corridor, despite the fact that it's only number 5 here, has to be one of my favourites across the entire series. I think there's very few tracks in any of the Resident Evil games which better encapsulate the setting as what this one does. And one of the most interesting part about that is the instrumentation, rather than being an accompaniment to your visuals, and in sense of it's giving you a theme or a music, sort of sense of musicality over the top of everything you're seeing there. On this particular track, Flooded Corridor really almost emulates the sounds that you can't, the sound effects, the actual, the dripping water, sort of strange echoes, wind rattling through air vents, that sort of stuff. It's actually bringing that to the forefront rather than adding any sort of hints of or sort of sense of musicality that you might see in other tracks we've mentioned so far, which is really interesting. But at the same time, of course, it's super eerie. It doesn't quite let the player settle down. Even though it is a relatively calm track, considering it's a track for when you're outside and you're fighting zombies or whatever else, or more precisely you're underground and fighting zombies. And when the dripping sound retreats, for example, and leaves the player with the sound of the choir, the sort of soft sort of spoken voice kind of thing, you could be forgiven for holding your breath as you wait for something to jump out at you, because there is that sense of build. Suddenly the dripping is gone, and you almost go, is something coming kind of thing, and then slowly walks you back to where you need to be again. It's a real masterclass, I think, in terms of how to kind of make something that really perfectly gets there. And as a side note, it really reminds me of Super Metroid. Never a bad thing. I love Super Metroid. Yeah,
there's a touch of John Carpenter in this one to me, which is funny because I always, when I think of that, it's more like the later entries, like Resi 2 has got more of that influence, but there's some of that in here, definitely. This is deeply terrifying, is how I would describe this. Just a masterclass in it, in fact, because it is, and I just said about notes repeating, this one, it has the same 4 notes over and over and over again until that point, like you said, where it stops and just leaves you hanging just before it carries on again at the last second, just those 4 notes. And then there's so much stuff going on beneath it. There's, as I mentioned, this weird discordant other melody that just seems to be doing its own thing. And listening back to this and the proper soundtrack, and we talked about this off mic, the less compressed PlayStation version, but the actual version that was written, there's a bell sound that just gets so intrusive. It gets louder and louder, and it's completely offbeat with everything else as well. It's heart in the pit of your stomach kind of stuff, this track, definitely. And I think the strength of it really shows, because when the remake of Resident Evil came out, I felt like a lot of the soundtrack was more inspired by the original game's kind of tone rather than remade tracks. There wasn't a whole load of them that they went, well, we'll just reorchestrize those or whatever. This is one that basically came full sail, I think, into the remake, if I remember rightly, or it's at least much closer to the original than a lot of the remake soundtrack is. So that, if nothing else, that definitely says how it stood the test of time.
Yeah, I definitely agree. I can't say more about this. And I think it's probably a fairly strong statement about the next 4 then, in which case, just a rough idea of just how strong they are to have not edged this one out to position 5. So track 4 is Concrete Bound. So, if Concealed Passage had a foot in how game soundtracks used to sound, Concrete Bound is definitely a nod towards where the series will be headed. It's, again, as we've talked about a couple of times before, it's a very simple but extremely effective loop, where a synth creates a sense of aftermath that we just hear again and again in Resident Evil, in Resident Evil 2, and obviously definitely Resident Evil 1.5 that didn't quite make it. And I mean, again, let's deep dive into that. Minimalism, non-traditional instrumentation, kind of replace strings and orchestral builds. It creates this very cold laments, I think. Like, it's almost something where it'd almost be comforting if it wasn't for the deeper sounds at the edge of your hearing. It's something where there's this idea of, I'm going to come back to it again. It's definitely aftermath. Some disaster has happened. Some emergency has occurred, and you're kind of creeping through the debris or the resulting kind of destruction, and sort of really seeing it. And it's unsettling, and it doesn't feel like you're in immediate danger. But at the same time, there's this definite sense of something could be waiting around the next corner, or it could be, there's almost this kind of, in your head, it's almost like walking over broken glass, kind of looking around at what's devastation for you. And I think it really, really works for the labs, for the laboratory. You've kind of gone through the mansion, you've gone through the gardens, you've gone through the guardhouse, everywhere else. And now you're here in the labs, and there's this sort of sense of, okay, so I'm at ground zero, effectively. I'm where this thing all went wrong. And it's quiet and it's eerie, but what is there? Kind of almost this sense of, I want to explore and understand what's happening here. And you almost have a moment to kind of, you're in the eye of the storm. Everything else spilled out from this place and just left this kind of crater for you to explore.
Yeah, I think it's really interesting how different the lab pieces of music in general are from the mansion. It shows that sense of progression because they are really differently approached. And less is more is such a, we can probably use that phrase many times about a lot of this, but this is a wonderful example of just knowing when enough is enough. You could have gone crazy with something like this. You could have added some extra bells and whistles, but this really is as simple as it needs to be. It's not. There's enough there to sort of let your mind wander. It doesn't want to tell you too much via the use of the music. It just telling the sort of baseline of the story, of the structure of the place that you're in, because it's so synonymous with that sort of square corridor in my head. You can feel the sound sort of bouncing off the concrete walls, which, again, appropriate name for the song, Concrete Bound. I love it how it stands out as sort of part of that journey, the difference from where you started.
Yeah, and what's really interesting actually is something I realised, listened to it a couple of times, in preparation for this, is there's a lot of familiar bars and themes in this that are actually from the main mansion tracks, which we'll get onto
I wondered
later
that.
on. They are actually the same structures, but they've obviously used different instrumentation to kind of layer it in. Excellent. Which is one of the reasons why, even though it's very stylistically different, it feels cohesive as part of the main whole.
Absolutely.
Which is really interesting. So, moving on, and we are coming to one of the more unusual track names, which is number 3, Vacant Flat. So I don't know who lives in the vacant flat. I don't even know where it is in relation to anything. I know it's in the guardhouse, but I don't know. I don't know where. Who owns the flat.
Good old umbrella landlords.
Yeah, right. No, so I placed this one here. It's an odd one. I could have probably put this one a bit further up the list, as in sort of further down the list, as it were. But I thought it was quite nice here because it's a nice. It manages to effortlessly create a sound which manages to be eerie, manages to be mysterious. Somehow it's also quite familiar, and it's a nice bridge to other sections as well, which really amplifies what they're doing. And that is no mean feat to combine all of those different things into one track. Yeah, this is very much a bridge. It's not the main guardhouse thing when you first get there. You kind of arrive in your guardhouse. You kind of wander around for a bit. It leads into this. And this is when you're sort of exploring some of the rooms and so on, and you're really kind of discovering diaries and kind of some of the stories of what happened here. And it's the first time you really start to deep dive a little bit into sort of the lab instance and so on, I think, and when you start to get a slightly greater sense. So as a result, it kind of leads nicely into that sense of suspicion that sort of taints the cutscenes in this location with Barry and Wesker, where you're understanding that not only is it's around the disaster is something where you need to kind of find out a true story, but also what's happening with your teammates. And then you've got the higher register stepping structure of this track as well, which leads you really nicely into the flooded corridor track if you sort of once you actually go underground. But then those same steps, when they sort of fade back, you also have this pensive pause that keeps you on your toes, and there's like there's a low kind of bump that happens, and it almost feels like in a weird way it's a precursor to Mr. X in Resident Evil 2, where there's a sort of footsteps following you, I guess. But it gives you this idea that there's some sense of trepidation out there in the darkness. So
yeah, what you were saying about reading the diaries and unraveling things is very, very accurate, I think. Some of our friends over at the Resident Evil podcast talk about sort of the perspective of this first game almost being like a detective story, like a mystery. And this song is very much the one that feels like that the most to me, because it's got these two melodies. The way they sort of like weave in and out of each other really gives that mystery feeling. It's like pizzicato strings and bells and stuff that should be soft, but the way that the melodies sort of, weave through each other. And they're soft instruments, but they're orchestrated in quite a threatening way. Every note is kind of intrusive, as we said with previous ones. And that's how the dread is created, I guess. I really love this one. I really love this one.
Yeah, really, really good way of saying that. I really like the language you've used there. That's the perfect way to describe it. It is a very aggressive way of using some of that language. Some of that music sort of the notes and so on, and it's very, very interesting. It's really
stuff that shouldn't be used aggressively. That's what's off-putting about it.
Yeah, which I think leads us nicely into number 2. So number 2 actually has 2 tiles. Is The Depth / Far From the Sun. Right, so I will be the first person to say that this was insanely close in my head, as I really wanted this one to be first, but I couldn't quite put it up there, which I'll get to the reason for in the next entry. This might have to be one of the most harrowing Resident Evil tracks I have ever heard, bar none, across all of the games. It has this deeply inorganic and discordant bass that just really simmers, and it pulls at your nerves throughout the entire thing. And it interjects this horribly unnatural, monstrous breathing sound over the top of the whole thing. And then, just for fun, this sharp metallic stabbing sounds that quite frankly would just laugh at most horror movies, just in terms of how they sound. I kind of get the mental image of all the vertical. I think back to Hitchcock, and I think of all the in Psycho, and I think of all the vertical lines you can see in the movie that he's put into the movie as you watch it through. Kind of give you image of what the descending knife, and it's very much the same here with that. And just to top it all off, as the breathing stops in this track, you then have this really alien, mechanical, almost heartbeat kind of dance across the entire scene. It really does feel like you're being pursued by something, and I think this is really, for me, this is the jumping off point where I think Resident Evil 1.5 definitely, I sort of had those very harrowing images of the police station with all the dead officers around, and kind of in the early footage. I think this is definitely kind of closer to the vision of what 1.5 was. It's just this unrelenting, terrifying, predatory track. I can't say enough more about that. It's just terrifying.
Yeah, it's you talked about Eye of the Storm for Concrete Bound. That's exactly sort of how I felt about this. This is such a great representation of what it must feel like to be at ground zero for everything that you've faced up to this point. You've reached the belly of the beast. And this is exactly what it should sound like. And again, as you said, 1.5, that is probably the direction the music should have taken, because now that belly of the beast has blown wide open and affected, the whole of Raccoon City. So good shout on that one. Yeah, just like Concrete Bound, just brilliant use of sounds just hanging in the air. Just creates such this thick atmosphere. Fantastic use of empty space. I can't say anything more than you have already. But yeah, damn. I didn't even think about that when I said, hey, pick 10. This was not one that I thought about, but when I heard it, I was like, yeah, absolutely, this should be this high up. This is such an underrated piece of music.
Cool. So then it got beaten by number one, which to be fair to it, number one is secretly, I think, 3 tracks built into one. We're gonna choose the first one, which is number 1, Wandering About. Now, I think this will be immediately familiar to anyone who's even looked at the back case of this game, quite frankly. I mean, there's just no doubt here. Anybody who played Resident Evil back in the day at all, bar none, will tell you how the mansion track still haunt them. They will just instantly remember that feeling, the lingering notes, the orchestral builds, everything else. I mean, this is a track which is far more orchestral than the series would typically become, and it's considerably more mournful. Everything else in Resident Evil is much more urgent, much more pressing for the most part, which is why when you have a track that isn't that, it kind of stands out. And I think like the marshalling yards for Resident Evil 2, for example, where they kind of almost have a slightly different feel to them.
Mm-hmm.
And what I think is interesting about Wandering About is this track dances a really careful line between establishing a recurring theme, which we've talked a little bit about with Concrete Bound, and I'll get onto in a second with a couple of the other sounds, teeth back in show, and a couple of the other tracks. But it creates something which you're going to hear again and again throughout the game as it goes through, but at the same time, just never loses its impact. It always feels something which just feels unsettling. It feels haunting. It doesn't, it's not welcome. You never want, this kind of sound goes on and it just plays at your nerves the entire time. And I mean, obviously, the other tracks I mentioned, they are Night Begins and Queer Structure, which is another slightly funky name. But I mean, effectively, they're all variants of the same theme, which is, if you want to give Resident Evil its theme, this is it. And they really employ different instrumentation, different accents. And if you look at Wandering About, the reason why I put this one here rather than one of those two is Wandering About is the most moving one for me. The higher register of the strings and the instrumentation pulls at my mind a bit more effectively, and sort of is more resonant and sort of stays with me for longer than the deeper and more brooding Night Begins, which is a touch more relaxed. And then obviously you definitely have, when you come back into the mansion after going out to the guardhouse, and you have Queer Structure, where it's the same effectively as Wandering About, but adds in some strings, I don't know the right term for it, but it's got some strings in between there.
It's definitely got some sort of like layering to it, doesn't it?
Yeah, exactly it. And I think that gives you more, again, of that predatory presence that sort of simmers into that. But I think for me, Wandering About is kind of the key, core, resonant, powerful experience that anyone who's ever found Resident Evil. This one is really what sets it apart from not only other games of the time, but also sets it apart from all of the other Resident Evils. It's literally that simple. This one for me is if you were to ask me, if you were to say to me Resident Evil soundtrack, this is the first thing I think of.
Yeah, I can completely understand that. And this is a wonderful example, as you say, of what it was doing different to other games at the time. The sort of, I mentioned it at the top, classical feeling rather than just video game feeling. It's kind of loose. Those strings sort of slide around a little bit. It's slow and it's ominous, but it does have pace to it to keep you moving around, but it's not all about intensity and rushing around. And yeah, mournful is such a wonderful word for it. It's bizarre. What an interesting choice, and I wonder what exactly led to the decision. Because there's so many sort of spooky music tropes they could have gone with for what is essentially, when you boil it right down, scary ghost house. It's been done in so many things, right? You're in a big empty building, and anything could be out there. If you wanted to boil it down to its pure essence. So you could have some really generic music, but they went in such a different direction with it. It's the mournful part is what makes you think about, what happened here? Who did it happen to? How has this affected those people who you're now seeing wander around undead? It connects everything together. The song connects the location to the enemies to the story, and which makes it extra wonderful that it stands out and is sort of part of what you immediately think of with the soundtrack. Also, I suppose, because you hear it a lot, because you're running around the mansion a lot. At this point, as harrowing as the score can be, because obviously you've heard it so many times, when I hear this now, it just brings me great joy because of nostalgic warm memories, but it absolutely shouldn't, I'm sure.
Yeah, well, I mean, yeah, it's yeah. I'm now wondering, just listening to you say that, whether you could put this over the top of Luigi's Mansion and see whether it would transform that game, But no, I agree. It's not quite something you want to walk down the aisle at a wedding to, but it is a familiar friend to most Resident Evil fans.
Absolutely.
And but yeah, so that's the list. That's my Resident Evil 10 list. I should quickly jump in if I can, and say there is an honourable mention on this, which is going to be the Moonlight Sonata.
Yeah, I think that's fair.
The Moonlight Sonata, I really couldn't in good conscience put in this list because it wasn't created for Resident Evil, which I don't think will come as a shock to anybody. But it is a piece that I really should mention because it really so perfectly fits the game. And it was an excellent choice to put in there. And it's something which I think is very, very evocative and wonderful. It's a weird one, actually. It almost fits into in the same way as what Final Fantasy would put in Eyes on Me, and I can't remember the track in Final Fantasy 8, and I can't remember the name of the one in Final Fantasy 9. But it's got that weird kind of slightly disembodied from the main soundtrack, almost like This Is Your Rockstar track to kind of drag in people who aren't familiar with things. But I definitely, I think it should be an honourable mention, but I couldn't quite in good conscience put it in the main list.
I love the idea of dragging people into Resident Evil on the promise that there's a Mozart song in there. All those Mozart fans, like, you should play this game. Mozart composed for it.
yeah. It's I'm for now a B-side. That no one knew about.
That's right. Well, this was excellent fun, Sherwin. Thank you for joining me.
No worries.
Thank you for your excellent list. If you enjoyed this discussion, please let us know in the comments below. And as I said, let us know what you would have included in your top 10 list of the classic 1996 Resident Evil soundtrack. And is it the classic? Is it one of your favourites? Is it not? Let us know. And make sure you subscribe to stay up to date with everything that we do. Other than that, thank you for listening and have a good week.